Welcome back to the Why Intercept. We are talking about storytelling. Why do stories matter? What is the purpose behind them? If you're going to be a trustworthy storyteller, what do you need to do to make that happen? Now, to back up, I'm going to start by telling you why I needed to even ask these questions in the first place. When I started putting my quotes on the market, I came to find really quickly that it's so hard to make short form content. It's really hard to share how and why I created the things I made, especially because they're weird. And the thing is, I tried to make content, TikToks, Reels, Instagram captions, but I wasn't doing it successfully. My TikToks were bombing. I just wasn't doing a good job. I really came to doubt my ability to tell stories. It was something that I could ignore for a pretty long time, honestly. And then it came to a head and I was like, we need to sit down and figure this out because this cannot be that complicated. Where I started was to understand, why do stories matter? How does our brain perceive them? And then how do we make a good one? What's the formula? Give me the formula and I'll do it. And that was not the answer. That really surprised me. So I'm so excited to share not only all of those steps, but also why it's so hard to make a good story in today's day and age. And with that, I'm your host, Samita Kathari. I have a degree in cognitive science with a concentration in neuroscience from the University of California, Berkeley. I started my career at Google. I then worked at Stripe, but I don't think any of those are reasons you should listen to me. I think you should listen to a few of these stories and then make up your mind for yourself. Okay, what is the purpose of stories? I don't know, they're fake. And for this reason, I figured, well, my deficiency makes sense. I don't read a lot of fiction. So if I don't understand the narrative arc of a story, it's probably not all that surprising. But here's the thing, I tell stories all day, just like you do. When we tell someone where we parked and why we parked a block further away, we're telling them a story. We're helping them make meaning of why our behaviors led to a certain thing. The more that I researched stories, the more I realized my life is not devoid of this at all. Every single part of life is a story. So they help us make meaning of the world. And that's so important because it's a complicated place. The problem with storytelling is because we rely on it so much to make meaning out of truth, sometimes a really well-told story can help us make sense of things in the wrong way. If we think back to World War II, stories were used in a non-positive way to persuade, and that's essentially what we saw with Nazi Germany and propaganda. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really happen all the time, but I actually read this really great book called The Storytelling Edge, and in there they use this example of America and why we think America is so great. And it's because of stories. They made a point that America has some of the most expensive and yet lowest ranked healthcare and education. And yet, Americans really think that they're the best. The reason for this that they posed is because of stories. Because Americans pride themselves so much on the underdog story of being able to defeat Britain, of being able to create democratic governments, and to have all these inventors like Tesla and Edison. America is just full of stories of accomplishment, innovation, achievement. And those stories are what allow Americans to just feel like, no matter what, this is the best country on earth, even if the rankings don't show it. That's the power of storytelling, and it's really motivational. It's a huge part of the dialogue when it comes to branding and marketing, because we know on some level that maybe they're telling us stories that we shouldn't trust. Those aren't really for our benefit, it's for theirs. And we are very scrutinous of stories. Like, we want to poke holes in them, because if we didn't have that natural inclination, we'd be misapplying them left, right, and center. And there's a really critical kernel in here that I think is what made it so important for me to understand the power of storytelling, because we are essentially entering into a contract with storytellers as to whether or not we should trust them. This contract that we enter into with storytellers, it's an important one, but it does make us question what the definition of truth is. Because I know I'm not the only one who's raised to believe that science is the ultimate arbiter of truth on all things. And honestly, I don't believe that it is, and I don't believe that it should be. So what does it mean then for something to have truth value in it? This is a debate that's been going on for hundreds of years. The fact that we even think we can perceive truth when our senses are so faulty is humorous to some degree. But here's the debate. Essentially, the two ends of the spectrum are, on one end, truth is up to personal interpretation, and on the other end, we have truth as this assertive, epistemic, perfectly validated definition. And what I came to find is probably somewhere in the middle, where essentially truth is the things that are well defined, but it's hard to investigate or even identify that unless they're relevant in some regard to our own experience. And so that's how we see both sides of the spectrum. What makes a good story in that case? If they help us make meaning from truth and they help us make meaning of the world. We can take the fable of the tortoise and the hare. That is a story that teaches us if you sprint really fast at the beginning, you may tire yourself out and you may miss the rest of the race. But if you consistently make small progress, you might actually get there faster than the people who don't get there at all in the first place. Even though it's based in this world of fantasy, it has some type of wisdom that helps us understand the world. But there's something really important about that story that I just told. And it is that I didn't just tell you the facts. I didn't didn't tell you that if you work slowly towards something, you might actually have a better chance of achieving it. And that's because if I just told you those straight facts, you may or you may not remember them. Information is hard for us to remember. There's a lot of information in this world, but if we're told a story around it, it helps us to remember because it's simple enough that we're able to translate it to our own life. For me, that might be something like knowing if I sit down to read a bunch of books, I'm probably not going to be able to read all of them back to back. But if I read a little bit every single day, I probably stand a better chance of making some progress. That is possibly a very different application of the same story that you might have to your own life because we have different lives. Power of story. From what I've found, it's not supposed to be interpreted for you. You're supposed to do that for yourself. But the other thing that stories do is they connect us to each other. Something else I came to learn was that researchers found when little kids shared their stories with each other, it fostered greater senses of empathy, support, tolerance, etc. And not just when they share their own stories, but when they just read storybooks in general. When we start to get out of our own lived experience and into someone else's, it helps us become better stewards of the group. And I know how reductionist that sounds. I'm just stating the evolutionary benefits of storytelling. There's a lot of them. It spurs our imagination. It helps us be more creative, which is the root of a lot of problem solving. So creativity, imagination, language, storytelling, connectivity, all of that, super important. What makes a good story in that case? If you're going to be a storyteller, what do you need to do to make that happen? There are two dimensions to this. There's the what, and then there's the how. So the what, these are all the important things that you need to make a great story, and then the how is how you put it all together. The what has these aspects: fluency, relatability, tension, novelty. A good story has to have some level of novelty to it. If you just hear that a man standing on two legs walked 10 meters, that's not a story. That's just a thing. Nothing novel happened. So it's not going to stick out to us. We're not really going to remember it as an important story, and it's probably not really going to teach us anything because of its lack of applicability or presence of doubt. We don't care. Second element, fluency. The point and purpose of fluency is that we don't want to make the end receiver have to work super hard to understand what we're trying to tell them. If we're telling them too much information, then they're trying to make sense of that information. And if that information isn't necessary, then we're basically defeating the point. A good story has to have qualities that make it easy to receive. So it can't be so long that it takes 10 years to tell. Although technically the story of Scheherazade was one in which she told it, over 1,001 nights or something. I may be getting that wrong. But there's some type of limit. The way that this shows up in social media, which is something that I didn't ever think about until reading this book, The Storytelling Edge, is that the authors talked about when we make short form content like a TikTok or a reel, and we pause super long on each clip, we're essentially forcing the viewer to try to think about why we're pausing, what that means, and it's why things that move really quick can be really, really valuable, because we're doing them the courtesy of only showing what they really need to know and not force them to use any extra energy. Third thing, relatability. This is essentially having characters that make sense, not totally impractical or unrealistic. I came to learn that there's this whole category of characters that are called Mary Sue characters. They're these characters that have everything good happen to them and have just an absurd amount of luck, and for that reason, they don't strike us as super compelling or realistic. One of the examples that I found was Bella Swan from Twilight, and honestly, that kind of checks out. It doesn't make sense that basically everything went right. Mary Sue characters. Okay, fourth and final thing, tension. There needs to be some type of conflict. You can't have a character that just sleeps on the entire story is that they've just slept all day. There's nothing that we're testing for. There's no conflict, nothing that we could doubt or question. Okay, those are the four elements. Just passing all of those elements when your audience already has their bullshit meter up is probably already hard enough. But of course, now we have to structure it into a story. And with that, we come to the how. There's so many different ways to structure a story, but by and large, all of them boil it down to having at least these three things. You need to have a thing that is tested and that comes out the other side with some type of transformation. That's basically it. So whether that's a person and that's the hero's journey, or it's some other type of fable in which you have a bunch of other characters, the point of the story is that we see how they're transformed at the end. And the way that Aristotle put it, which is much clearer than I just did, is that he says a great story establishes what is and then what could be. The way that the authors of The Storytelling Edge describe this is that's the point of a great storyteller, is to find that gap between what is and what could be, and to make meaning of that gap, because within that gap is where the audience has doubt. Why did this thing happen? The storyteller is supposed to make meaning of that and tell us not only how to close that gap, but why closing that gap might have opened another one, and then how closing that gap might open another one, and then you just keep going until we've fully arrived at the end of the story. I read all this and I was like, oh my God, this is my eureka moment. And if this doesn't sound like a scientific experiment to you, then let me just tell you right now, it is. Hear me out. That curiosity signals something so important in all of this, and that is the presence of doubt. Doubt is one of those trigger words for me. Actually, what's the opposite of a trigger word? Something that just like makes you so excited and so happy. I'm gonna think of what the phrase should be, but if that's a thing, doubt and eureka, those are my two opposite of trigger words. The reason that I love the word doubt so much is because growing up, science was always the practice of proving things. And yet after learning about Richard Feynman, a very famous scientist, that changed completely on its head. He wrote something, and once I read it, everything was different. I'm gonna read that for you now. He says, I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it is much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. In order to make progress, one must leave the door to the unknown ajar. He just changed the game when it came to science. Science was not about truth. It was about exploring our doubts. It's about doubting the things that we know to be true. Is that really true? What if we tested it? If we take the story of Little Mermaid and I told you, hey, when we first meet this girl, she's a mermaid, and then a period of time elapses and she's a mermaid. That doesn't mean anything. The thing that makes it mean something is learning that between that time period, she got legs because she wanted to see what it would look like to pursue an above land romance. She wanted to experiment with what it would be like to have legs and go test out this thing. And a scientific experiment is set up the exact same way. You take a thing, you apply a hypothesis to it, and you see what happens at the end. And that's something that I love to read. Whenever I prep for these podcasts, which I analyze, and it's about 40 to 50 hours of prep for each episode, I love sitting there hunched over reading all these different experiments. And it's so hard to explain until I came to realize that gap between what is and what could be keeps me so hooked, so motivated. I have to know why the input led to the output. I have to know what happens at the end. So it's kind of no different. If I wasn't all that well versed at reading fiction, at least I've read a lot of scientific studies and I can use that to better formulate my own content. So I had this framework in my head now. Now the only thing left to do was to apply all of these learnings to my own experience. So if I were to tell you I made a jumpsuit out of a neck pillow, that's the thing that I did. Great. Where is the story in that? There is no story. If I were to tell you the story, there's so much more I could tell you. And yet, that's not a story that fits into a reel. And I've talked about this with other creators all the time. You basically get somewhere between 60 to 90 seconds, and it is so not the whole process. And yet, it's one of the most normalized forms for storytelling. So how do we get around this? Well, going back to this book, The Storytelling Edge, the authors basically talk about the fact that in this day and age, you just have to use data. You have to analyze your audience. What do they like to watch? Where do they drop off? You have to analyze everything. I hated this answer. I know people have social media managers for this reason. They analyze everything. It works for them. But that wasn't sitting with me because based off of everything that we've just learned, the most important part of a good story is the truth element. It's helping people make meaning from truth. You can't do that if you're only sharing specific content based off of the audience. It's not an accurate story. And then I discovered an incredible article that was written on this very topic that I'm going to highlight and bold in the references because you guys must go read it. But it was about this idea shared by Walter Benjamin way back in the early 1900s that is so relevant to today. And frankly, basically the answer to everything. If you don't believe me, my friend called me while I was reading this article, and I actually just made her stop and listen to how profound this was. Walter Benjamin, our hero of the day, was a German philosopher and helped me understand not only the art of storytelling, but also what he proposed to be the death of the art of storytelling. Buckle up. The art form of storytelling is something that originated as an oral tradition. It's something that we passed down over generations. This was just the way we told stories for the majority of our existence, and the oral nature is an extremely important part of it for two reasons. When we tell people something orally, my primary assumption, thinking about the game of telephone, is a lot of things are going to get messed up and it probably won't be that accurate. I love having all my perceptions challenged and changed because that is actually the very thing that makes it most accurate in this super weird way. Hear me out. When we tell a story over and over again and it's not written down, the only things that get passed down, especially if you have forgetful people in the society, are the things that matter, the things that are the most accurate. And because we all tell these things through the lens of what our own personal experiences are, that just actually re-solidifies this truth to begin with. So it's actually a feature, not a bug, that it is not written down and it is not reproduced perfectly each time. That brings us to the second thing, which is temporal validation. Temporal being the passage of time means that if something is told over and over and over again, that helps us stress test it across different communities and cultures and time periods. So we're only passing down the most profound wisdom when we share it. That must mean that that truth is pretty powerful. So that's just the importance of something that can withstand the passage of time. The antagonist to oral storytelling is the birth of the novel. This blew my mind. Walter Benjamin does a really good job of describing this, so I'm just going to use his own words. He says, the decline of storytelling is the rise of the novel at the beginning of modern times. What distinguishes novel from the story is essentially dependence on the book. Because in the art of storytelling, the storyteller is asked to take what he tells from experience and then cater what he tells to make it applicable to those who are listening to it. The birthplace of the novel is the solitary individual. And because of that, not only is he uncounseled through the sharing of the story, but he's also not able to use the story to counsel others. He basically says that if you're going to embark on the art form of telling a great story, your job is to tell the story in a way that the person can receive it. The oral nature of storytelling, it lets you do that. Oral storytelling is adapted to the audience. A storyteller could adapt to a certain culture or age group based off of what he knew they'd be able to take from it. We had this profound ability to personalize these stories in a way that made them meaningful to us. When it comes to all other types of literature, the fairy tale, the legend, those all come from oral tradition, and they also go back into oral tradition. But the novel neither comes from oral tradition nor does it go into it. It doesn't participate in that same feedback loop, and that distinguishes it from storytelling. It's kind of like when a 5-year-old asks you where babies come from. You're not going to tell them the same story that you might tell someone who's a teenager. Obviously, you have to tell them a story that they can understand, they can make some type of meaning out of, and that's going to be a very different set of details than you might share with someone who's of an older age. This makes so much sense. Of course, you are going to take the same story and you're going to adapt it to your audience. For the audience to make any type of meaning out of it, those adaptations could be wildly different for the exact same premise. In fact, they have to be. And it's not as though that's fully lost with book form. It's just different because when it comes to a book goes out to the masses. That's why this was so profound to me. Because when we make content and we make a reel, we're not adapting it to the audience. We're just not. You're putting it out there to the masses. And now I could better understand why the authors were so intent on using data. Because if you use data to isolate who that audience might be, at least you have someone that you can talk to when you make something. The only problem with that is that audience can oftentimes change. That content just goes out to God knows whoever, the algorithm, right? But beyond that, this right here helps me so deeply understand the feeling I was having with the content that I was creating. There's this genuinely uncomfortable feeling with this idea of making things for a very specific type of person when we all know rationally that's not the only person looking at your content. Your mom might be watching it. Your cousins might be watching it. There's so many different ages and cultures and preferences and attention spans that you're trying to vie for. We're not adapting it to the audience. We're just not. Okay, what do we do now? I don't think that it means we just throw up our hands. I don't think we go, we're done. If we can't make a story for everyone, we're making a story for no one. I don't think that that's the answer, because that's the other part of the cognitive dissonance. There's creators who do it really freaking well. It's possible. It's totally possible to create great stories and beautiful stories and to share those broadly. If there's one thing that I know about difficulty, difficult is not where the story ends, it's where the story begins. I know that in order to figure this out, I now actually need to go find other stories, different stories, people who not only have figured this out in today's day and age, but to figure this out over and over and over again. Because I don't want to copy how they did it. I want to understand how they thought about how to tell their stories with a bunch of different changing formats, because the world we live in will just keep changing. So just like any good story or any scientific study, the value of it isn't going to be the information, it's going to be the meaning. And more specifically, meaning that's shared in such a way that I can make meaning in my own life from it. And that's what I aim to do. One final thought, and it is from Kobe Bryant, and something that I didn't realize is that he was deeply passionate about storytelling. I had no idea how much this man cared about the art form of storytelling, and it makes me think about this quote. It was a sentiment that he shared at the end of an interview with Jay Shetty, in which Jay Shetty asked him, what is a message that you would leave to all future storytellers? And he said, in just the most simple and beautiful and powerful way possible, his message to all future storytellers would be to create from truth. That is the utmost respect for the art of storytelling and for the role of a storyteller. And I think that's really dignified. This contract between the storyteller and the story receiver is probably one of the most important relationships we have to one another. It's the way that we create meaning. It's the way that we interpret truth. That shows so much integrity. So that's what I aim to have, and that's what I aim to do. This might be the end of this story, but it's the beginning of a brand new one. And as cliche as that is, I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you enjoyed parts of it or some of it, I think we can all just appreciate the fact that I have no idea who you are. So I couldn't tailor this to my audience, but that's just a better appreciation for this thing that all of us are doing nowadays, talking into our phone and trying to create something meaningful. And on that note, if you have any stories to share with me as to what you learned on this episode, please reach out. I would love to hear them. You can find me on Instagram at bysoom or at the Y-Intercept. You can find me on my website, bysoom.com. If you want to tell someone else the story of what you learned on this episode, please share it with them. Best way to support this. Hope you enjoy the rest of the stories that you get to experience today.